They blocked her lake access with a cold letter and a metal fence. What they didn't know, she used to design entire cities. One trench, one storm, and the HOA president's perfect garden turned into a swamp. She never raised her voice. She just let nature speak. This is the quietest, smartest revenge you'll ever hear. Karoline Leavitt had always dreamed of quiet mornings by the lake. Not a mansion, not a yacht, just peace. A dock, a fishing pole, a place where the sun could rise on still water and silence would speak louder than traffic or politics. She'd saved for years, working long shifts as a project engineer, cutting costs, living modestly, until she finally bought her dream, a cozy, waterfront home in a small, serene neighborhood called Lakewood Shores. The view? Perfect. The lake? Sparkling and calm. The neighborhood? Tidy. Respectable. The neighbors? Pleasant, for the most part. Karoline thought she'd found her forever escape. A place where she could breathe, heal, write, reflect, and occasionally walk the winding path from her back gate to the shared community dock, a small wooden platform used by local residents to fish, kayak, or simply sit and watch the water ripple with the breeze. But then came Douglas Crane. He wasn't just new to the neighborhood, he was a force. Wealthy, well-connected, and newly elected as president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. While most HOA leaders hosted monthly BBQs and worried about flower beds, Douglas came with a clipboard, a suit, and an agenda. Within just 1 week of taking office, the change began. No meetings, no votes, just notices, regulations, infractions, and then came the fence. Karoline returned home one Tuesday evening and saw it, a tall, gray metal fence cutting straight across the small pathway behind her property. The very path she had walked on every single day since moving in. Worse, there was a lock on the new gate, and hanging beside it, a freshly printed sign, Private Lake Access. HOA Restricted Zone. No entry without authorization. Karoline's heart sank. She dropped her groceries on the porch and ran to the mailbox. There it was, an official HOA envelope. The letter inside read, "Due to rising liability and maintenance concerns, lake access has been temporarily restricted to executive lots only. Your property does not qualify under current guidelines." No discussion. No explanation. Just one cold decision made behind closed doors. Karoline stood frozen. The place she loved most, the small dock, the peace it gave her, was suddenly off limits. Not because of danger, not because of erosion or repairs, but because someone decided her property, her presence, wasn't executive enough. And who now had access? Douglas Crane, of course. His massive home stood 2 lots down, one of the executive properties grandfathered into the new rules. He could walk to the water anytime, host parties, park his speedboat, watch sunsets over wine and jazz. Karoline, the woman who loved that lake long before Douglas even moved in, was now locked out. But she wasn't one to complain. She didn't storm into meetings or start yelling in Facebook groups. Instead, she did what she always did in hard moments. She breathed. She boiled water. She poured herself a strong cup of tea, sat on her back porch, and stared at that fence. The lake was still there. The sound of the water hadn't changed, but something inside her had. She wasn't angry. She was calculating. Karoline hadn't always worked from home. Before her quiet life, she was a civil and environmental engineer. She had spent years designing roads, drainage systems, and erosion controls. She knew how water worked, how land behaved, how careless people were about natural flow until it flooded their foundations. So while the HOA might have taken her path, they'd overlooked something far more dangerous. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a homeowner. She was a woman who understood the ground beneath their feet. And as she watched the sun set behind that ugly gray fence, her mind began to move. Where does the runoff drain during a storm? What direction does the water slope in? What if that slope changed? She took a sip of tea. Then she stood up, went inside, and opened the drawer where she kept her old project maps. They took her view. They blocked her peace. But they had no idea what she was capable of. What Douglas didn't know was that Karoline wasn't just a quiet homeowner sipping tea by the lake. She was a former civil engineer, one of the best in her field. For over a decade, Karoline had worked on urban planning teams that designed water systems for cities. Flood zones, drainage grids, runoff flow, erosion control, these weren't just topics she had studied. She had shaped them with her own hands, blueprints, and fieldwork. She had watched careless developers ignore water flow, only to be humbled when their basements flooded or lawns turned into swamps. So, when Douglas Crane, the man who took her lake access without a second thought, built his grand estate with a perfectly manicured lawn that sloped ever so slightly downward toward the waterline, Karoline noticed something he didn't. The natural slope of the land meant that during heavy rains, runoff water gathered from the neighborhood and trickled across properties, right past hers, and directly through the green velvet carpet that was Douglas's pride and joy. She hadn't thought much of it before. But now? Now it was an opportunity. An opportunity not for vengeance, but for a reminder that you can't gatekeep nature. That sometimes the earth has a way of pushing back, especially when nudged by someone who knows where to push. Karoline waited. She checked the forecast. Rain expected all weekend. Perfect. She spent the next 3 evenings under cover of dusk, dressed in old work pants, gloves, and a hoodie. No loud machines. No major tools. Just a spade, precision, and years of engineering knowledge. She didn't touch anything on Douglas's land. That would have been illegal. Instead, she worked entirely within her own property, where her rights still existed. On the first night, she dug a small, narrow diversion trench, strategically positioned at the rear corner of her yard. Not too deep, just enough to guide water. A soft bend here, a subtle curve there. By morning, she covered it with mulch and native grasses. It looked like nothing more than simple gardening. The second night, she adjusted an old rock garden she hadn't touched in years. Repositioned stones. Buried a French drain pipe that would gently redirect overflow, aimed not with destruction, but with precision. Rainwater would now choose a more direct path toward the Crane estate. The third night, she planted thick hedges and tall shrubs along her side. Not just for cover, but to ensure water didn't seep toward the HOA's preferred direction again. Everything she did was subtle, silent, legal, and undeniably effective. And then, the storm came. It started on a Saturday. Soft drizzle, then steady sheets of rain. Karoline made herself a cup of tea, sat on her porch in a raincoat, and watched as water pooled gently in her trench, then curved, flowed, and rolled onward, following the invisible trail she'd created. By noon, Douglas's yard looked damp. By evening, it was soaked. And by Sunday morning, the man who blocked off the lake now had one of his own right in the center of his garden. His grand white gazebo? Surrounded by ankle-deep water. The imported turf? A soggy mess. The stepping stones his wife had designed? Barely visible beneath the muddy runoff. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Some whispered. Others giggled. But no one said a word. The HOA sent a maintenance alert about unexpected drainage issues. Douglas roamed the edge of his property, yelling on the phone to landscapers, surveying the mess with boots splashing through puddles. Karoline? She just smiled, quietly, peacefully, because her message had been delivered. She didn't need to shout, protest, or break rules. All she had to do was let nature do what it does best, with a little help from someone who actually respected it. Then came the rain. It wasn't a hurricane. No thunder, no lightning. Just a steady, soaking storm, the kind you forget to fear, but remember in the aftermath. For Karoline Leavitt, it was the kind of rain she had been waiting for. The kind her trench had been designed for. She stood by her window, tea in hand, wrapped in her old flannel robe. calm, ready. Outside, the newly carved diversion trench along her garden's edge was already at work. Rainwater flowed into it like clockwork, silent, purposeful, unbothered. It slid around her yard with barely a ripple. But where did it go? Right where Karoline intended, through the natural slope, and straight to the low basin nestled in Douglas Crane's elaborate estate. At first, it didn't seem like much. A few extra puddles, a soft squish underfoot, but by sunrise, the real picture unfolded. Douglas Crane's once immaculate lawn, drenched. The deep emerald grass had transformed into a soggy patchwork of brown and green. The garden's prized hedge maze, his pride during HOA tours, was underwater at the roots, wilting by the hour. The koi pond, once clear and decorative, now churned with foamy brown runoff, the fish sluggish and confused. And there, in the center of the disaster, sat the HOA president's favorite white bench, half submerged in 3 inches of rainwater. Douglas stood outside, holding a massive black umbrella, jaw tight, pacing like a man who just lost control of his kingdom. Karoline? She just stood at her window, smiling. That same calm, pleasant smile she gave him the day she found the access denial letter in her mailbox. The letter that said, in stiff HOA jargon, that her backyard was no longer welcome near the lake she paid taxes to live beside. The letter that triggered the quiet storm. Now, the roles were reversed. Karoline had lakefront serenity. Douglas had a swamp. The HOA acted fast. They called landscapers by mid-morning, then plumbers, then flood prevention specialists. Clipboards in hand, they stomped around in boots, scratching their heads. Drainage failure, one muttered. Possibly city runoff, another guessed. Douglas wasn't satisfied. This is sabotage, he snapped to a groundskeeper, pointing at the pools of water strangling his ornamental ferns. He sent emails, demanded an investigation, even suggested the city had rerouted storm lines. But no one suspected Karoline. Because Karoline never broke a rule, never touched HOA land. Everything she did was on her own soil, guided by the same earth that once carried water gently downhill, long before fences, gates, or politics got involved. She didn't need revenge. She believed in reminders. And nature, when encouraged gently, had a way of whispering them back to the proud and the powerful. Days passed. The landscapers kept trying. They dug shallow trenches in Douglas's yard, built ugly temporary levees, replanted half-dead shrubs. But nothing worked, because every time the skies darkened, the soggy parade returned. And every time it did, Douglas's estate sat a little lower, a little wetter. The HOA grew quieter. The accusations stopped. And the gate behind Karoline's backyard? Still locked, but suddenly less defended. Less important. Neighbors started to whisper. Not out of gossip, but out of admiration. They knew something had happened. They just didn't know what. And Karoline? She never said a word. She waved to neighbors, brought cookies to the next HOA potluck, offered gardening tips when asked. Her lawn remained green, her plants blooming, her nights peaceful. Douglas? He stopped attending meetings. He no longer gave speeches about order and regulation. His voice grew smaller, his lawn darker, his authority washed out. The quiet genius Karoline didn't need praise. She didn't brag about what she did, because her win wasn't about flooding a yard, it was about restoring balance. A balance that arrogant power had tried to steal. She had reminded Douglas and the entire HOA that control has limits, that people who build walls should understand what flows under them, and that sometimes the softest hand can move the strongest system if it knows where to press. As the spring rains came again, the gate behind her yard began to rust. And Karoline? She sat on her porch once more, tea in hand, lake in view, peace reclaimed not by fighting back loudly, but by letting the earth speak for her. The shift no one saw coming over the next few weeks, word started to spread. Not just about the flooded garden or the soggy koi pond. People started connecting dots. Why was Karoline's lake access denied so suddenly? Why did only a handful of properties, conveniently those closest to Douglas Crane, get executive access to the lake? Then, other stories came up. The Martins were fined $200 for hanging a set of colorful wind chimes their daughter had made in art class. The Velasquez family had their application denied for a small vegetable garden. Reason? Doesn't match neighborhood landscaping aesthetics. A disabled veteran down the street was told he couldn't build a small ramp on his porch unless it used approved decorative material, which cost triple the standard what he could afford. All of this had been brushed off as policy enforcement under Douglas's leadership. But now, it started to look like something else. Favoritism. Micromanagement. A system designed to benefit the few while suffocating the rest. And then came the clincher. Douglas tried to file an insurance claim for the flood damage to his garden. But the insurance company flagged something strange. The neighborhood's stormwater mapping hadn't been updated in 15 years, which meant the water flow plans, the ones used to determine drainage responsibilities, were outdated, possibly invalid. And according to HOA bylaws, maintaining those records was the HOA's legal responsibility. Douglas's responsibility. It was like watching a house of cards collapse. The board scrambled. Emergency meetings were called. Legal counsel was brought in. But it was too late. A resident, one of the previously silenced voices, started a petition for transparency and board restructuring. And this time, people signed. Fast. Dozens of homes joined. The neighborhood Facebook group turned from recipes and lost cat notices to long threads about HOA abuses and overreach. Karoline never once campaigned. She didn't give speeches. She didn't gloat. She didn't point fingers. She just showed up to the next meeting and listened. She nodded quietly as residents shared their frustrations. She looked Douglas in the eye when he tried to defend his decisions. And she smiled just once when a neighbor stood up and said, "Why don't we let someone with common sense and real-world experience lead for once?" Then came the motion. A quiet, clear voice from the back of the room. "I nominate Karoline Leavitt for HOA president." Another voice chimed in, seconded. Then a third, and a fourth. No one nominated Douglas. A new chapter begins within days. It was official. Karoline was elected HOA president, unanimously. And from her very first meeting, things began to change. The gate blocking lake access? Removed by unanimous vote. The outdated water infrastructure? Scheduled for a full review and remapping. Those families who had been fined or denied for trivial reasons, reimbursed or given special consideration. Karoline introduced something the HOA hadn't seen in years: fairness. She didn't lead with ego or rules for some logic. She led with logic, empathy, and a quiet strength that people trusted. Douglas didn't speak much after the election. He sold his koi fish, canceled the hedge maze renovation. At the next board meeting, he sat in the back row, quiet, no clipboard, no speeches. Maybe he'd learned something. Maybe not. But the neighborhood had changed. Karoline had proven that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to move with purpose. Plan carefully. And let the results speak louder than revenge. Months later, Karoline walked by the lake one morning, no gate in sight, just clear water and the soft sounds of birds. A neighbor waved. A child rode by on a bike. Peace had returned, not through conflict, but through quiet rebellion and unmatched grace. Because Karoline wasn't just a homeowner. She was a reminder that when those in power overstep, the smartest response isn't always noise. Sometimes it's simply knowing where to dig. Absolutely. Here is an expanded 700-word version of the final section of your Karoline Leavitt HOA story. It's crafted in a cinematic, emotionally rich, and YouTube-friendly tone, perfect for audience retention and emotional payoff. The final move: Karoline didn't waste a single day. The morning after her unanimous election as HOA president, she met with the neighborhood maintenance team, this time not in secret, not behind closed doors, but out in the open, clipboard in hand, jeans and sneakers on. The very first thing she did? Remove the gate. The same cold, metal barrier that had cut her off from the lake months earlier was gone within hours. No debate. No committees. Just a simple directive signed and posted on the community board, effective immediately. Lake access is restored for all residents. Neighbors cheered. Some clapped as they passed. One woman even baked cookies and left them on Karoline's porch with a sticky note that read, "Thank you for bringing back the soul of this place." But Karoline wasn't looking for praise. She had work to do. Listening instead of lecturing next, she implemented something entirely new for Lakewood Shores: open forums. Monthly. Mandatory for board members. Open to all residents. There were no time limits on speakers, no judgment for complaints, no eye-rolling from the board. Just real people being heard, some for the first time in years. At the first forum, a retired teacher tearfully shared how she'd been fined $300 for painting her mailbox a non-compliant shade of blue. At the second, a single mom asked for permission to install a rain barrel system to help water her small garden. Karoline approved it on the spot. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of restoration, restoring trust, fairness, and the dignity that Douglas Crane's regime had slowly eroded. A quiet goodbye to the past, and then Karoline did something no one expected. She returned to her backyard, pulled on gloves, picked up her shovel, and began to quietly fill in the trench. The very trench she had dug with such precision. The one that reminded Douglas and everyone else that control can backfire when used unfairly. It wasn't out of guilt or fear. It was closure. She didn't need the trench anymore. She had made her point. And she had reclaimed her place not just by the lake, but in the community. When she was done, she planted a small rose bush in its place. Nothing flashy, just something beautiful and patient. A wordless understanding. The next morning, Karoline was sipping tea on her porch, as usual, when Douglas Crane walked by. He was no longer HOA president. No clipboard. No entourage. Just a man with a stiff posture and tired eyes. He stopped briefly at the edge of her fence, looked down at the freshly packed soil where the water once flowed. Then he looked up at her and gave a small nod. "I suppose the water finds its way," he said. Karoline didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply smiled and replied, "It always does." He walked on. The quiet power of grace. That single moment said everything. No public apology. No confrontation. Just a quiet understanding between two people who had played a game and knew who had truly won. Karoline's leadership wasn't about power plays. It wasn't about proving superiority. It was about showing people what real strength looks like. It's not loud. It doesn't bark orders. It doesn't build gates. Real strength listens. It adapts. It rises and lets its actions echo louder than its voice. Legacy at the lake. Over the next year, Lakewood Shores changed. The rules were simplified. The fines were made reasonable. More families used the dock again. Children played by the shore, laughter echoing across the water. Karoline stayed the same, quiet, thoughtful, strong. Neighbors trusted her, not because she made speeches, but because she made change. One neighbor later wrote in the community newsletter, "She didn't just redirect the water. She redirected all of us towards something better." And so, the woman they tried to fence out became the one who opened the gates. If this story moved you, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button, subscribe to Unseen Genius, and turn on the bell because every underdog has a story, and here we tell the ones no one else dares to.